Excellencies, distinguished guests. My name is Keris Jones, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Farmers' Constituency.
Keris Jones works for the United Kingdom's National Farmers Union, or NFU. The distinguished guests that she's addressing are ministers and heads of state at the 24th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the year-end climate talks, or COP24, which took place the first 2 weeks of December in Katowice, Poland. She's speaking to heads of state, but she's doing so on behalf of the world's farmers, or more specifically, on behalf of 70 farmers' organizations around the world, which together work on behalf of hundreds of millions of farmers. Let me say that again. Hundreds of millions of farmers, big and small, who cultivate our fields, grow our food, and emit about 20% of our greenhouse gases. Until last year, farmers, as opposed to ministers of agriculture, were nearly invisible at these global climate negotiations, which is tragic for them and for all of us, because research shows we can get 37% of the way to meeting the Paris Agreement's 2-degree target just by improving the way we manage our forests, farms, and fields. But how can we do that without including farmers?
Here in Katowice, we were very happy to have seen the first baby steps of the Koronivia joint work on agriculture.
The Koronivia joint work on agriculture that she's referring to is a new and long overdue effort to incorporate farmers into the global mechanisms for slowing climate change. Koronivia grows out of a farmer-led initiative that began over dinner at the Marrakesh talks 2 years ago.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Earth, we broke it, we own it. And nothing is as it was. Not the trees, not the seas, not the forests, farms, or fields. And not the global economy that depends on all of these. But we can restore it, make it better, greener, more resilient, more sustainable. But how? Technology? Geoengineering? Are we doomed to live on a bionic planet, or is nature herself the answer? That's the question we address in every episode of Bionic Planet, a podcast of the Anthropocene, the new epoch defined by man's impact on Earth. And today we'll hear how the world's farmers moved from the fringes of global climate talks to the center. My primary guest is Fred Yoder, a fourth-generation American farmer who's been working his 1,500 acres for more than 40 years and who's emerged as a leading proponent of climate-smart agriculture. I ran into him in Katowice, Poland.
My name is Fred Yoder. I'm the chair of the North American Climate Smart Agriculture Alliance. That includes Canada, United States, and Mexico. We're a part of the Global Alliance of Climate Smart Agriculture. We're the North American chapter of it, and we try to figure out ways to make farmers more climate smart.
Mm-hmm. You know, what I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit, I didn't even know that this alliance existed. How did this come about?
Well, about 5 years ago, I was invited to a Global Alliance Climate Smart Agriculture Alliance meeting in the Netherlands. And one of the things that we saw was the only ones that were negotiating a solution was the ministers of agriculture. There were no farmers there. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we pleaded with them is include farmers, because everyone down there was figuring out a way that farmers needed to change their ways, but there were no farmers to actually react or understand what was going to happen. So we pleaded with them, and they started including farmers. And when that happened, we started talking about how different landscapes have different requirements. North American agriculture is going to be different than maybe African or Asian or South American, and so they requested to have different segments or different chapters. We decided to form the North American Alliance, which included our three countries, and then we started going back home and working with getting farmer leaders involved, and that's the difference between us and maybe some of the other segments of it. Is it's farmer-led, but we include everyone. We have academia, we have NGOs, the NGOs at least that really believe and understand farming, and then we also have equipment manufacturers, seed companies, fertilizer. We all want to work together and understand what we have to do to be more resilient, to be less risky as we grow our crops, and then also, as a result of that, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But that's the thing. CSA, or climate smart agriculture, should mean the same no matter where you are in the world. And that's our three pillars. The first pillar, of course, is profitability and sustainability, because farmers respond to economic incentives. The second pillar is adaptation, which we have been adapting to a changing climate, whether we admit it or not, but also soil resilience. And how do you make the soil more healthy and resilient and include more carbon so we can take some of those droughts and floods more easily and adjust to what the environment's telling us. And of course, then the third would be the one for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So if you do pillar 1 and pillar 2, pillar 3 happens automatically.
Exactly. I'm sure you read the report that came out just before last year's climate talks. It's saying that natural climate solutions can get us 37% of the way to the 2-degree target. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Oh, yes, sure.
Yeah. And one of the ones that jumped out at me was nutrient management. Nutrient management is fertilizer management, because fertilizers are nutrients for plants, and the most common nutrient we feed plants is nitrogen, but not in its pure form. We feed it to them blended with hydrogen in the form of ammonia. Here's the thing, plants mop this stuff up, which is good, but if you give them too much, they die. And too much activated nitrogen also depletes the soil and mixes with oxygen to form nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas that traps 300 times as much heat as carbon dioxide does. You may remember this from episode 31 of Bionic Planet. Nutrient management then means applying the right amount of fertilizer or adding cover crops that pull nitrogen in from the air and infuse it into the soil, which dramatically slashes greenhouse gas emissions and increases yields, as we learned in episode 7. It's all part of a new approach to farming called permaculture, which I'd like to cover in depth for you because it's fascinating and important. If you want to learn more about permaculture and how all of this impacts your food security, your retirement account, and your children's future, then help me help you by giving me a 5-star review on Radio Public, Stitcher, or wherever you access me. That's important because the more reviews I get, the more ears I get. And the more ears I get, the more minds I can reach. And only by reaching hundreds of millions of minds, literally, will we fix this mess. We can do it if we all work together. You can also help me produce more episodes by becoming a patron at bionic-planet.com, where you can support me for as little as $1 per episode. Or you can help just by accessing me through the right podcatcher, namely access me through the Radio Public app. That's Radio Public, like public radio but backwards. They automatically pay me a few cents for everyone who hears an episode all the way to the end. One of the ones that jumped out at me was nutrient management, what a cost-effective solution that is, and how it can actually pay for itself, right? If I understand right.
It certainly can, because we can actually demonstrate where if you do a better job of saving nutrients and making sure they stay put, you can save up $100 an acre, because if those nutrients leave, you have to replace them. And so when farmers understand the economics of maybe using cover crops to sustain those nutrients for the next crop, then all of a sudden he can save money. And farmers will respond to economic incentives, whether you get a subsidy or not. This is something you can do on their own, and it works.
Maybe flesh that out a bit when you talk about cover crops and nutrient management. I've mentioned it on the show, and I know a little bit about it theoretically. But in practice, what does it involve, this nutrient management?
We've been growing cover crops and experimenting with cover crops for the last 5 or 6 years, and it's not as easy as what people sometimes might think. You have to find the right cover crop for your area. We were starting out growing cover crops after wheat, which you have 2 or 3 months of growth, where we grew a lot of winter peas and radishes and things like that, some exotic things, and some legumes to grow some nitrogen for the next crop. But after a corn-soybean rotation, you're limited on how much time you have. And so we sort of went to all cereal rye as a cover crop, and so we have the air seeder following up the combine as soon as the combine goes through and takes the beans off, and so all of our soybeans have been seeded into cover with rye, and then as much as the weather will allow us, we do the same thing with corn. This year, unfortunately, with the problem of late rains, we're still not done harvesting. So again, I'm living climate change. I mean, we have had 50% of the rain we normally get in a year in the last 30 days during harvest, and that's not supposed to happen. So again, you have to manage those cover crops. One of the problems we have with farmers in the spring, if they don't kill those cover crops at a proper time, then you have some problems with slugs and some other stand issues. But so we're also crop consultants back home, and so we try to get every farmer to try something that they don't normally do, stick their toe in the water, try something new on a small amount of acreage, and you'd be surprised how many times that you can get a farmer to change his ways by actually doing it a little bit himself and building on those successes.
What you're describing sounds a lot like what I see in Kenya, where they're shifting to more diverse farms, and they might have only 4 acres and you might have 1,500, but it's the same idea that you're more aggressively managing the land to manage it more sustainably, right? Is that?
Oh, that's true. But the thing at this conference here, we hear an awful lot about the smallholders, and it's really, really important that the smallholders can adapt to new management. But I will tell you this: agriculture needs help, whether you're medium-sized or large or whatever. We're forced in the United States to do some different things because of economics. The prices of commodities are very low right now, and so the first thing a farmer wants to do is how do you save money? And one of the ways you save money is save trips over the field. That means no-till or strip-till.
No-till. What's no-till? What is that?
No-till is when you actually farm without actually disturbing the surface. All you do is some people call it slot farming, but what it basically does is you cut a hole in the surface just big enough to put the seed in, and then you have your surface covered with the stover from the previous crops. We've done that. We've been continuously no-tilling for at least 15 years. And one of the things that you'll notice is my ground is completely full of earthworms and a lot of porosity with the rotted channels where the roots had been before. And you go to where somebody has been tilling for many years, and it's just dead. There's no structure. We're proving now you can get a yield increase just by having your soil health, and you've actually mitigated your risk of having the soil in wet weather. That you'll go through there and you'll make ruts when you have no soil structure, and I don't make the same problem as they do. So it's really important that the reason I went to no-till was for economics, but I will tell you one thing: I would never go back to farming the way I used to, because I've seen such the value of the soil health and the resilience that my farm has today it never had 10 years ago. And combine that with some cover crops and start working more with Mother Nature and finding out what's happening underneath the surface of the soil, more than just adding X amount of nutrients and saying there you are. So it's a different perspective, but it's also a management tool. Like we are promoting precision agriculture, where it's variable rate technology. So you only fertilize the areas that need it. You only weed the parts that need it, and so there you take the same amount of dollars and you spread them over a lot more area. And so economics has forced us to do a lot of stuff. A lot of people think that nothing's happening in the United States on climate change, and that's simply not true. We're adapting, but it's just not in a very public and formal way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is it because you have large agribusinesses running these big, huge farms? They can't really do the sort of targeted management at scale that a small farmer can. Is that accurate, or is that just...
No, that is not accurate.
Okay.
What is accurate is even the larger farmers, which, by the way, are still mostly family farms. They're just larger. The only reason they're incorporated is because of tax reasons. But most of the larger farms actually have hired their own agronomist, and they can actually do more targeted research and things like that. The problem is that when you have the basis of your farm's survival on the price of commodities, then we have a tariff issues right now, and all of a sudden we found out that our bottom line has completely been flipped over. Now the only way you survive is cut costs, and so by trying to cut costs and improve your soil health and your risk management through the climate change issues with higher degrees of droughts and also more apt to get a big rain and things like that. Is so then you have to figure out how to make more resilience. And so farmers are really in tune with soil health today. It's because of economic stress rather than trying to mitigate greenhouse gas. But the result is mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, plus the fact that as you're sequestering this carbon, your soil health is just going much higher. And so it's a win-win situation for farmers, but you got to get them talking about adaptation to climate change rather than arguing about whether it's man-made or whether it's natural. It's happening, so let's react and let's do it.
Yeah. The tariff issue, I don't want to get bogged down in that, but in the news it looks like it's really hitting you guys hard.
It's really hitting hard. I'm not a big farmer, 1,500 acres, but between May and today, my farm has lost over $100,000 just because of the cost of the tariff issues. We were exporting a third of our crop, of soybean crop, nationwide to China. It went to zero, and so that amount of soybeans has to be absorbed someplace else. We're finding new markets for that. The Argentina and Brazil folks are taking our place with China, but we're picking up some places where they have not been able to fill. But the bottom line is we got the cheapest soybeans in the world right now, and we're not making any money. We're actually selling beans at below the cost of production today, and so it's. While I think most of the Midwest farmers are trying to be supportive of the president, I'm not a fan of tariffs. And to me, my biggest concern is when you have tariffs in for a long period of time. We've seen this. I'm a big believer in history. It takes years to get those markets back. Yeah. And that's the thing. This is long-term damage.
Why are farmers continuing to support the president in this situation?
Well, the president has tried to convince the Midwest farmers that this is going to be short-term pain, long-term gain, that we need to help with the manufacturing sector of the world and also some other things that we import from China, as well as what they do. So because we have a surplus of trade with agriculture products with China, we're the low-hanging fruit. So the brunt of the force of the repercussions is coming to Midwest agriculture, and yeah, it's been hard, but I will tell you, unless something's done pretty quickly, I think the president will probably end up losing a lot of support in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm. One concern that I have with the shift to Brazil is just that if China's buying from Brazil, we could see an increase in deforestation associated with soybeans. Is that something you've looked into, or is that?
Oh my goodness,
yeah,
that's the unknown, unreported repercussions of these tariffs. We were going on the right track. I mean, and I've been to Brazil 4 times, and with the whole Red Plus system, and they were going to be part of the solution to greenhouse gas emissions, and now because of these new markets, they're clearing land as quickly as they possibly can. Rainforests are back to being destroyed to plant more soybeans, and it's really a shame because we have plenty of land to grow all the surplus soybeans that need to go to China. There is. This is a political problem, and it's the unfortunate thing. This is exacerbating greenhouse gas emissions, and so climate change is getting worse because of tariffs.
Yeah, it's so frustrating to see these issues they don't have to exist from a scientific or agriculture or even an economic perspective. There's all this land laying there that's ready to be farmed, and then we're chopping forests.
And the other part about this is I probably spent the last 20 years traveling the world talking to new end users that we supply with commodities, with whether it's corn or soybeans, and we have personal relationships. We wanted to demonstrate we were reliable suppliers, and things were going along splendidly, but now we have a government intervention that stops those markets and stops those relationships from continuing. I was in China this past summer talking to those end users and saying that, hey, we like your products, but we have to defend ourselves. So it's a tit-for-tat thing, and it's a big, giant game of chicken. And unfortunately, somebody's going to lose. In fact, I think we're both going to lose if we don't do something. I was relieved to see the conversations that the president and Chairman Xi had over the weekend at Buenos Aires, that they took a brief pause, but that's still not the answer. We have to really understand that the sooner we get this thing done, the better, because Brazil actually planted soybeans quicker this year than they ever had. They will have beans ready to export in January. And if we don't start sending beans to China, before January, we've lost that window of opportunity, and so all these soybeans, this record soybean crop that we had in 2018, we'll have to find another home, unfortunately.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Where will it go? Will it go into feed? Will it go into tofu? I mean, what can be done with this to prevent it from just going to waste?
Well, it's going to go to soybean meal, which is feed, and then also soybean oil, which many parts of the world use that. That's their mainstay of cooking oil. There's also a lot of technology that is being developed for non-food uses of soybeans. But the bottom line is we're swimming in soybeans, and we're the world's cheapest soybean right now. We're stepping up a lot of our sales to European Union. They're buying a lot of our soybeans that would they normally get from Brazil. Again, we're the lowest priced soybean producer in the world right now, so it'll go someplace. But there's already talk that we're going to probably have at least 10 million acres of less soybeans produced next year. Based on market opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk now about the solutions that you're working on. The alliance you've created. This grew out of the Ban Ki-moon's New York Climate Summit in 2014. So this emerged around the same time as the New York Declaration on Forests and a lot of other more high-profile initiatives. Tell me a little bit about your alliance, how it came together, what you aim to accomplish, and how it fits into more the whole global move towards sustainable agriculture.
Well, it was our belief that whatever the plan is for agriculture to reinvent themselves, so to speak, or transform into something more sustainable or more productive, the farmers had to be at the table. Too many times we have somebody create a grand plan for somebody else and say, here it is, work it. Farmers are smart. Farmers are the leader farmers are very innovative. And they can tell you right off the bat whether it'll work or whether it won't work. But when they're told to do something that they don't want to do, they find good ways around it. So if you really want to move the needle, if you really want to reinvent the way we structure our agriculture system, then farmers have to be at the table. And that's really what NACSA, or the North American CSA, was developed on, was having farmers as a leader, but include and bring in other shareholders and people that have a stake in agriculture and say, this is what we can do. Can you help us? And develop a plan based on what the farmer can do on the farm rather than the grand plan. And it's really one of the hard things to work with this with the COP24 here is we're going through this Koronivia workshop process, and it's so slow, and it's we're having these workshops over the next 2 or 3 years, and so it's going to take that long just to get a chance to put a plan together. The time is now to put something together. Let farmers have it. We can do it.
Koronivia, spelled with a K, is a common nitrogen-fixing grass, and the Koronivia joint work on agriculture is a relatively fast-track process for helping farmers around the world coordinate on meeting the climate challenge and engaging the United Nations climate change apparatus. Koronivia emerged from the 2017 climate talks, or COP23, which the government of Fiji chaired in the German city of Bonn. But the farmer-driven agenda actually emerged the previous year at COP22 in Marrakesh. It was the first COP after the Paris Agreement, and it opened with the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. Theo de Jager is president of the World Farmers Organization.
I've stopped counting how many times we came to COPs all over the world with so much expectations, only to leave disappointed again. Originally, agriculture was not even included in the Kyoto Protocol. We had a lot of expectations on how agriculture would be covered in the Paris Agreement. Until at one stage, 2-3 years ago, the farmers, I think it was in Marrakesh, said to each other over a dinner, well, how long will this continue? Shouldn't we just come up with a farmers-driven agenda and thrash it out with our colleagues from across the globe? And then instead of coming to visit COP, listening to what the parties have to say about how they think agriculture can go about towards the adaptation and mitigation of climate change, shouldn't we just bring an agenda to COP?
To be fair, some environmental NGOs had been pushing to get farmers into the process for years. And some farmers' associations, including the American Farm Bureau, had been pushing back, as had a few environmental NGOs too, arguing that including forests and farms would detract from industrial emissions. On the other hand, some farmers began, individually at first, gravitating to climate-safe agriculture. That gravitation eventually became a true movement, and that's where the World Farmers Organization comes in. It's a federation of 70 regional and national farmers' organizations, some focused on smallholders, some focused on young farmers, and others focused on large farmers.
We first and foremost went to all the farmers' organizations we know. Hence, we have the president here of the Pan-African Farmers Organization and UMNAGRI, the Arab-speaking organizations in the north of Africa. We went to the Asian Farmers Association, went to the farmers in Latin America and in Europe. We signed an agreement with SEJA, the representative organization for the young farmers in Europe. And we sold the same dream to them all. Take this as your own. Drive it. This is a farmers-driven agenda. It's not going to happen by itself. We have to make it happen.
It was a global full-court press, with the national farmers' associations working with regional and global NGOs, as well as seed companies and even fertilizer suppliers to push for representation within the UNFCCC, or UNFCCC. That led to the creation of Koronivia, which is following a path that was first cleared by the Coalition for Rainforest Nations and others in getting forestry into the Paris Climate Agreement. That path was this. And first, let me warn you, this may seem either obscure or obvious or maybe even boring, but it's actually important, difficult, and, I think, fascinating. Within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there are multiple negotiating streams called subsidiary bodies that focus on specific issues and then pass their solutions up to the Conference of the Parties itself. One of these bodies is called the Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice, or SUBSTA, which focuses on sticky science and technology issues, while another is the Subsidiary Body for Implementation, which focuses on, well, getting things done. These separate streams were created for a reason that I won't go into here, but it made sense at the time. Yet forestry got into the Paris Agreement in part because the two bodies worked together. And now Koronivia is doing the same, with workshops and negotiations jointly taking place in both. As Yoder points out in a bit, lots of competing interests and ideologies converge in these talks, and that slows things down. It took more than 25 years, for example, to get forestry into the mix. And not because it's overly complicated, but rather because a handful of very vocal NGOs thought that including forestry would distract from reducing industrial emissions. And, in my opinion, it also took a long time because mainstream media failed to shine a light on this process, which is why farmers and others took so long to engage. I'm working on an episode or two that will correct that by bringing the history of these talks to light, with a focus on forestry, how land use was locked out of the Kyoto Protocol, how the Coalition for Rainforest Nations revived it in 2004, and how it still took 11 years to get it into the Paris Agreement in the form of what we now call REDD+, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation plus Other Land Uses. This is a lot to absorb, but for now, just remember that farming is following a path that negotiators first cleared to create REDD+. And that path is bigger than Koronivia. It also involves the global coordination of stakeholders that De Jager described earlier. Jason Funk of Climate 180 touched on this in episode 38. Here's an excerpt.
Here in the negotiations, there's been a long process. This issue has kind of languished for a while. It was part of the original convention in '92. It wasn't really until 2011 that the countries agreed to actually start having real discussions about this. So by that point, REDD+ was already well underway. Lots of forest issues were being dealt with, and people understood what that all meant. But in agriculture, we hadn't had those same discussions. And there's sort of a different group of people with interests in agriculture. So it's been a long evolution of like talking about, so what are the things we need to deal with here? There's been a special emphasis on the needs of smallholder farmers who make up the most numbers, that they feed the most people in the world. And it was acknowledged that we want to make sure whatever we do in the climate space is also serving them and helping give them new opportunities as well. Last year, the parties agreed not just to have workshops and discussions and technical conversations about these issues, but to bring them in a formal way into the negotiations. And they decided to do that under two subsidiary bodies, one of which deals with science and technological issues, and the other deals with implementation. They didn't want more research necessarily. They wanted things that they could take home and apply and implement. So at this meeting, we've had sort of the first kickoff of that series of discussions that will carry through the end of 2020. They've developed sort of a schedule of the different issues they want to tackle. This one was a little bit of a look back at all the issues they've talked about so far and those technical discussions, and they wanted to bring that all into play. They also wanted to bring in other organizations that are linked to the UNFCCC process and who are also doing work that relates to agriculture, to understand what they're doing, so we could kind of put together the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and understand what the overall picture is. Who could do what, where there are still gaps, and what capacities already exist that we don't have to recreate. So the discussion here, they had a workshop earlier this week. We heard from those other bodies, and they made a series of presentations. The outcome of that seemed to be, well, there's some overlap here. There's also still some missing pieces, so we think there is real work that needs to be done going forward. Yesterday, then, they met, not in a workshop, but in an actual negotiating session, and a number of countries said, okay, well, we feel more informed, we know what's going on, but we think that there are these gaps, and we would like to talk more about those gaps as we go forward. So they'll continue along the schedule of this roadmap. The process is it's named the Koronivia process, the joint work on agriculture, and that will continue according to the roadmap they agreed at the last COP. They've begun that process here in a formal way, and then they've also started to realize that there may be additional issues they need to add to that agenda that they need to discuss, which was envisioned, and there's flexibility in there to do that. And they're starting to realize, like, okay, well, we now have some things to talk about in more depth.
I talked to a few other farmers here, and they all said they appreciate the rigor, but they also worry, rightly, that the process is taking too long. Fred Yoder again.
What we're trying to do is develop metrics that these practices actually do what they say we're going to do. So it's based on outcome. To if you do X and X and X practice, then you can count on this much reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's really what farmers want to do anyway. And farmers are doing that now anyway. Whatever they do as far as precision ag or cover crops or no-till, they know. They have to know what the bottom line is. Right. How much is it helping or hurting their operation? And that's really how we're going to get to where we need to go. And that's what needs to be included in the discussions here at COP24.
Mm-hmm. Are you finding that the door is open to these discussions, or what can be done to open it wider and move things faster?
Well, I don't know if you've had a chance to go to some of the side meetings, but some of the frustration I have is there's a lot of folks here that have an agenda that come to, but they're defending their part in what they do, and one of the things that it's really bogging us down is going through the process of deciphering, are you helpful or are you hurtful to this process? In my mind, is let's get her done. Let's just find ways to get it done. And so this process is laborious and it's tedious, and we have these workshops and we have to figure out how to gather and include everyone's thoughts. But it's very cumbersome. And so one of the things that we've heard on the sidelines is folks like the World Farmers Organization. They want to empower their farmers and clear across the globe, and let's get the farmers together and decide, what can we do? And NACSA is working with the World Farmers Organization now to get farmers together, and maybe we can help move this thing along quicker, because expertise in some of these areas are important, but there's also a lot of expertise on the farm as well.
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I have a theory too, and it's this. One reason these talks are going so slow is because our major media have failed to understand, let alone explain, climate change or its solutions. They failed for decades to warn you how bad things really are, and now they're failing to help you understand how we can fix this mess together. Farmers are woven into nature, so they've recognized the risk and are now unifying to engage the Paris Agreement process and address climate change. But mainstream media, which is my tribe, by the way, it's where I came from, still are not getting it. Most outlets still aren't giving their people the time they need to understand it, while grandstanding writers like Naomi Klein and George Monbiot have rightly recognized the threat, but they seem intent on torpedoing any solution that isn't instant and miraculous. That's counterproductive. I started Bionic Planet because I felt that I was becoming part of the problem, part of the climate echo chamber, part of the group kicking around solutions that will only work if everyone gets involved, but doing little to bring all of you into the process. My goal with this show is to take what I've learned over the past decade and translate it for those of you outside the climate echo chamber, to give you the tools you need to navigate the new reality of life on a managed planet, to help you understand how this new reality impacts you, how it impacts your food bills, how it impacts your job prospects and your children's future, not to mention your retirement account and civilization itself, because it does impact all of these, as do most of the issues I'm exploring here. And if these are issues you want to learn more about, then help me help you by giving me a good 5-star review on iTunes, Radio Public, Stitcher, or wherever you access me. That's important because the more reviews I get, the more ears I get. The more ears I get, the more minds I can reach. And we have to reach hundreds of millions of minds if we're to get out of this mess. And these farmers groups prove that it's possible if we work together. Today's show is a byproduct of an article that I'm writing for Ecosystem Marketplace, and you can access the article at ecosystemmarketplace.com. It'll go into a lot more detail than the podcast does, and you can thank my employer, Forest Trends, for its existence. You can also thank the Environmental Defense Fund for helping me cover the bandwidth costs of the podcast and some of my additional time. The most successful shows that I've produced, however, aren't those that come about as a byproduct of an article, but they're the ones that I create explicitly for the podcast audience. It's a whole different way of producing something. And to do those really well, which I don't think I've done yet, I need to allot more of my time and to hire a sound designer and a producer, even if on a freelance basis. Just listen to the credits at the end of your favorite big-budget podcasts. It's always more than one guy on a PC working in his spare time. If you find value in what I'm delivering, you can get more Bionic Planet by becoming a patron at bionic-planet.com. You can support me for as little as $1 per episode, either via bionic-planet.com or via patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Finally, you can help just by accessing me through the right podcatcher. Namely, access me through the Radio Public app. That's Radio Public, like public radio but backwards. They automatically pay me a few cents for every listener who hears the show to the end, and that adds up.
The thing we have to be sure we don't allow, and that is to put one farming system ahead of the other and saying, I'm right and you're wrong. And
right.
So we hear a lot about the smallholders, and it's really important. We hear a lot about agroecological methodologies. And agroecological themes work on big farms as well. So, depending on what you're doing as far as underneath the soil surface with your microbes and you're working with Mother Nature, whether you're big or whether you're small, it's still important. So, the question becomes is how do you do something in such a monumental way that you affect change? And if you just do small holders, it's not going to move the needle. And we're not going to be able to feed the people. One of the reasons I work so hard in these areas is I'm really concerned. How do we feed the 9.5 billion people we're going to have by 2050? We can't do it the way we're doing it now. And we certainly don't want to be continually clearing more rainforest to make more land to do it. Let's just do a better job with what we have. Sustainable intensification, that's the word we use a lot.
Yeah.
And so how do we do more with less and create something that's going to last much longer than what we have in the past?
Yeah, and what can consumers do? Because we can't just leave it all up to the farmers. Consumers have to know that maybe we should have to pay a little more for food, or maybe just understand more what goes into the creation of food or what the economy is like, especially in the U.S., where we have this weird rural-urban divide that's kind of opening up.
Well, that's an excellent question, because I do believe, this is my personal belief, is that civil society or the consumer needs to be involved. We can produce some of these ecosystem services as we produce this massive amount of food, and I think the consumer should be involved and be able to help pay for it. Things like clean water, clean air, biofuels that we can create less greenhouse gas emissions and things like that, maybe we need to have some way that they can contribute to some of these ecosystem services, because we're using up resources. We need to create more resources, and that's the whole thing about flipping this thing over.
Ecosystem services are something else I cover a lot on this show, most deeply so far in episode 19. An ecosystem service is the tangible benefit that a living ecosystem delivers to us all. Forests, for example, absorb greenhouse gases and regulate water flows, while wetlands filter water and mangroves protect the coast. Payments for ecosystem services are payments made by those of us who benefit from ecosystem services to those who provide them. A farmer who maintains a filtering patch of natural grasses along a stream, for example, takes his own land out of production to protect a waterway, and payments for ecosystem services compensate him for that. Part of the farmer-driven agenda is to explore payments for ecosystem services.
So my understanding on ecosystem services in the U.S. and everywhere really is that farmers have been reticent because they don't want to be allowing people on their land. If it's water quality credits based on the amount of runoff you have from a farm or something, that would require people coming to look at what's happening on the farm, and farmers are a little bit reticent about that. Is that an accurate perception, or is that, again, one of these things that I've heard that...
Well, it's certainly not accurate in Ohio, because I don't know whether you're aware, but we have some problems with algae blooms in Lake Erie. And one of the things that's happened in the past last 2 years is the commodity groups as well as Farm Bureau has funded a multi-million-dollar study it's called edge of field testing. What is actually leaving our fields? And it's scary. I mean, when we have to have a starting point. I mean, how do we know what contribution we're making? And so we're considered non-point source pollution, and all the other municipalities are considered point source pollution. And so we're getting blamed for a lot of stuff. We need to know what our contribution is, and the fact that if we can curtail that and we can keep it on the ground with cover crops, we're saving money. So I think that maybe was relevant in the past, but today I think farmers really do want to be, at least in Ohio, they want to be known as part of the solution, not just the culprit of everything bad, but the solution. And that includes getting the livestock folks in, and manure management has got to be a part of the answer, as well as how do we put on chemical fertilizer and do it in a proper way and to timing. And we've adopted the 4R solution set, which the Canadians have really started. It's the right rate, right time, right amount, and the right product. And so if we do all that right, that right there will be enough to cut our losses in half. But we can do better than that. I think when it comes right down to it, farmers are finally realizing that they can have their cake and eat it too. They can do things in a better way and make more profit by changing their ways than they actually have in the past. And they also understand that that's the only way the future will bring us enough productivity to feed everyone.
Fred Yoder closing out this edition of Bionic Planet, and in the weeks ahead I'll be trying to pick up some of the threads we touched on here, such as how the U.S. trade war with China could increase deforestation in Brazil, and also the history of REDD+. Notice I said try because I do have a full-time job, and if you'd like to get these episodes sooner rather than later, be sure to support me by listening through the Radio Public app, which pays me a few pennies for everyone who listens through to the end, or becoming a patron at bionic-planet.com. Thanks again to the Environmental Defense Fund for stepping up with help on this episode, and to my employer, Forest Trends, which makes everything I do possible. And be sure to check out the accompanying article on ecosystemmarketplace.com. It'll go a little deeper into the weeds than the podcast does. Until next time, this is Steve Zwick, now back in Chicago. Thanks for listening.